Let's continue preparing our city block sim, starting with fixing the chopped off buildings that we left off with in the previous video. And we can do that by selecting the edges that belong to the points inside or outside of the block. Let's drop down another group node. And let's call this spillover buildings, because this is going to be what we're going to be deleting in the delete node later on. Let's call that $OS again for spillover buildings in the group name. We also want to set the spillover buildings group to points. On the number tab, we want to turn off enable, and we want to go to the edges tab and enable that instead. And now we want to find the edge depth parameter. So if we scroll down, we have a tick box here, edge depth. And if we set that to say 100,000 or a million, we should be able to select all the points that belong to the points inside or outside. So for that, we need to select which point group that we're looking at. And we're looking at the outside city block. Right there. And now if we mouse click on the spillover buildings group, we look at our selection, we can see that aside from all the points outside of the city block, we've also selected a number of points that are now inside the city block. And it does that in that spillover buildings group, which looks for edge connectivity. This means that if there are points inside the city block connected to selected points outside the city block, will also be selected and thus removed. This means that we can remove entire buildings rather than just sections of them. For precision's sake, let's just rename this node to outside city block instead of outside block. And let's bypass it for a second and unbypass it again, because sometimes it doesn't really pick it up. The result should still be the same. Nope, outside block is different as well now. Let's call that outside city block. And we're back to where we want to be. Now let's visualize our delete node and see what happens. Again here, outside city block needs to be selected correctly. And now we can see that we have some weird faces hanging around. Even though we are actually selecting the edges connected to points from outside the city block, we have unpacked our buildings but not fused their faces together. So we're going to have to do that as well. Let's zoom out, go back to the top, and underneath our pack, drop down a fuse node. There we go. And let's set the distance to 0.1. We can see that doesn't actually change anything, and I'm quite convinced that that's because our group nodes do not automatically update. So let's bypass them all and re-enable them. So that doesn't seem to work either. Houdini is being a little bit of a pain. Let's drop down a new delete node instead. Let's set the entity to points, wire that into the spillover buildings, copy that name, visualize the delete, and just paste that name into the group node. And that works. So we've updated our group nodes successfully. I know they sometimes do not update, that bypassing then helps, but in our case, that delete node also for some reason does not want to pick up the new selection. So let's delete that. And our new delete node should do the trick instead. That's just updated on this front. Now, if we visualize the bounding box city block node, in this case, I can see that our building selection is quite precise. It works, but from experience onwards, and I want to save you this trouble, I can tell that the selection we want to have should be a bit more precise. So let's drop down a resample node underneath the unpack, and let's leave it set to 0.1. What you can see now is that we have a lot more points on the edges. And that means that if a building is just falling outside or inside of the selection, it might be missed. And in this case, we just increase the chance of it being found. Let's visualize the final node. Another small tweak we want to do is make sure that the selection is precise. If we look at our scene from this viewpoint, we can see that our bounding box is set exactly at 0 together with the buildings. We kind of want this bounding box to envelop the entire block entirely. So let's go up above our bounding box city block node, drag it down a bit, and put down a transform node. And what we can do now is we can look at our poly extrude and find our distance, right click it, copy parameter, and then in transform, as we visualize it in the translate Y, we can remove the 0 and paste copied relative references. What this does is it's going to move it up, but what we want to do is we want to move it down, so minus it at front. Let me Alt-E that to make it bigger for you, but we also want to divide that by 2. If we then hit apply and accept, we should have our bounding box sat in the middle of our grid. And now if we look at this and our bounding box, we can see that it envelops it entirely above and below. Let's continue at the bottom of the chain. Let's call our delete node red. And now if we look at our spreadsheet, right click and spreadsheet, and look at our primitive attributes, we can see that we have 6 times the same bbox name. So bbox 374 times 6, bbox 376 times 6, and that means that we can repack these objects again by name, which is what we want to do. We want to drop down a pack node, and we want to say name attribute. And then if we look at our spreadsheet again, we should have all of these paths only once. So there's 1374, 1376, etc. Let's close that. Now if we look at our spreadsheet once more, we can see that the attributes that we put onto their points in previous sections of this course are now gone. That's because when we're packing and unpacking, we're not correctly transferring them across, but in this case, we don't really need them there. That's the reason that up here, I haven't actually transferred them either. So at the unpack, we haven't transferred our attributes. We don't need them here. There is one very important detail that we do need, and that is if we look at our fuse, we can see that our normals on the points actually point outward from the actual object. And we had normals on these points that corresponded to the rotation of these buildings. If we go to our fuse 1 node all the way down, there's a tick box that says update point normals. You want to untick that and look at your viewport and see what happens. And now you see that the normals are pointing all in the same direction, because from that single point, after we unpack it, we simply make sure that all these points have that same normal. Then when we pack it back later, that rotation will still be intact. Let's zoom out and go back to the final node. And in our pack node, in transfer attributes, say normal, just n. And now if we middle mouse on the pack node, we should see that we have a normal attribute there. We can wrap this section up now. Let's drop down another null node. Since this is an out node, a final out node, let's color it green. And we can call it out_city block. If you'll join me in the next clip, we can continue.